Well, good morning. It's already been such a special morning. Are y'all doing okay? All right, good. Yeah, you are good. Great. Well, listen, it's been several months ago now that I was able to sit down with Tullian. It was the Sunday following Fallen and Free. Who in here was at the Fallen and Free conference that we did? Yeah, a handful of you. It was a great event, and Tullian and I spent the Sunday following that event kind of recapping all that had been heard, all that had been discussed together. And so we're kind of going to do the same thing this morning, except around the Merciful Wall series that just finished last week. So that was a 10-part series that started in January and carried us all the way up until late April, mid-April. And there were a couple breaks along the way there. But who in here has followed most of that series, the Sermon on the Mount, the Merciful Wall series that we've done here? I've also kept up with it a good bit and am excited to engage a conversation with Tullian today. So I've got some questions prepared. That's okay. I don't know if you have anything you want to say before we dive in.
No, I don't. Let's just go for it. Yeah.
So when I read the Sermon on the Mount, and when I reflect on all that I've been taught about the Sermon on the Mount, and I know you addressed this in the series, it lands to me not like a merciful wall. It absolutely lands to me like a ladder to climb. And then when I further survey all that I've heard across the past 20 years of my life about the Beatitudes and the Sermon on the Mount, I don't think I've really ever heard anybody present it the way that you've presented it. And I'm not saying that you're wrong, but I'm saying that while it feels right to me, and what I heard in the 10 sermons from you lands in my spirit, in my heart, like, yeah, this is a cool drink of water. This is grace. This is the gospel, what I'm hearing about the Sermon on the Mount. Because it's so different than what I've heard, I push the pause button initially and say, okay, why? Are we the only ones who believe this? And I'm not saying that creates unrest, but it does make me pause and ask a question. How do we know this is the right way to interpret this passage? Does that question make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. Of course it does. So let me be the first to say that over the years, I've had people come up to me and say things like, wow, I love your message. I love your message. And while I'm grateful for the compliment, I'm always quick to remind them that it's not my message. That this may seem new, but it's really old. It only seems new because it's so old and has been lost for so long. And if you grew up like I did in or around church, then you, for the most part, came away with the impression that the focus of the Christian faith is the life of the Christian. So when that becomes the paradigm by which you read the Bible, everything in the Bible seems like an instruction manual on how to keep yourself clean, and in keeping yourself clean, you are staying within God's good graces. So I never heard anybody growing up say anything like God's love for you is conditional. Nobody said that. But what was implied in all of the instructions that we were given on how to live was that if I was successful in living the way I was being instructed to live, that God would love me more. And to the degree that I failed to live the way I was being instructed to live, God would love me less. Not that he would cast me out, okay, because Jesus got me in for good forever, but that I could live or behave in such a way that would forfeit God's acceptance of me, or God's blessing, or God's love, or whatever you want to say. So I think the reason why I'm always encouraged, actually, when somebody hears, for instance, the series, let's say the Merciful Wall series, and they wrestle with it. Because in wrestling with it, they are acknowledging that they're thinking about it and that they've heard something different To the people who go, oh, I love it, and this is the way I've always heard it. I'm like, well, then you weren't listening, because this isn't the way I always heard it. It's not the way I grew up believing it. I was taught this, by the way, from other people. I didn't just come up with this stuff on my own. I was guided along the way by a couple of really key figures, people that I know, people that I wish I would have known, but never had the opportunity to meet. People like Paul Zoll, who was here, Fallen and Free. He did a series on the Sermon on the Mount, probably back in like 2008. And I think it was called The Merciful Impasse. And I had never heard that before. I had been to college and I had been to seminary, and I had been academically trained at a high level. The places I went were very academically demanding, and I had never heard what Paul had to say. So that was kind of my first, but then he was quoting people and referring the people who were listening to his sermons, he was referring them to books and referring them to authors. And so then I went, look, I said, is this just something that Paul says? Kind of like, what you just said a minute ago. And discovered that, no, this is the way the people that I admire the most have interpreted the Sermon on the Mount. And I think more important, let's not just sort of extract the Sermon on the Mount from the rest of the Bible. I think it's super important that we understand, and we were talking about this on Tuesday nights for the most recent Sanctuary Studies. It's really, really important to understand that God speaks two words. Two words. All of the words in the Bible can be lumped into one of two categories: a word of law, or a word of demand, and a word of gospel, or a word of deliverance. God's law exposes us. God's gospel exonerates us. God's law diagnoses us. God's gospel delivers us. And so anything we read in the Bible that either explicitly states or implies do is under the category of law. Now, God's law is good. It comes from God. We need to hear it. I'm so prone to believe my own press and to rest in my own rightness that I need God's law to remind me how desperately I need his grace, how woefully I fall short of his demands. In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus is preaching. It's his sermon on the Ten Commandments. So when he summarizes the Beatitudes and the sections that follow the Beatitudes on anger and lust and those sorts of things, and summarizes that in Matthew 5 by saying, therefore, be perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect. In other words, he's summing up everything he's just said for the people listening to say, listen, everything I just said can be summed up in this phrase: be perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect. Now, some people look at that and go, okay, well, if Jesus told us to be perfect, that implies that we have the power to be perfect. So anything short of perfection is failure. We have to do it. But that's not what he's doing. In saying, be perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect, he is exposing our imperfections. He's helping us come to terms with the fact that we can't be all that God requires us to be. We can't do all that God requires us to do. We need a substitute to do for us what we could never do for ourselves. So Jesus, in essence, is using the law in the Sermon on the Mount to expose the fact that everybody listening needs the gospel, and that he himself is the embodiment of that good news, which is why he says, I haven't come to abolish the law, but to fulfill it, because that was the rap on Jesus. The rap on Jesus was that he was soft on sin. He was always welcoming the people who shouldn't be welcomed, the bad people, the people that were sort of moral outcasts, the spiritual misfits. And so the religious leaders of his day were constantly sort of charging him with being soft on sin, with sweeping God's demands under the rug. And he quickly corrected that and said, I haven't come to abolish the law. That thing needs to be fulfilled, full on, fulfilled. That every I needs to be dotted, every T needs to be crossed. God only accepts perfection, period. He doesn't accept our best efforts. He accepts perfection, period. Well, that demand is supposed to expose us. so that we finally come to the realization that we can't do it. We need someone to do it for us, which is, of course, Jesus. And so I think part of the reason why we may struggle when we hear that is because we've been taught wrong, in my opinion.
But that's the essence of my question, is how do we know we've been taught wrong?
If you walk away from a book, Christian book, or a sermon, or a teaching, or even a song, and your immediate impression is, I need to get out there and do more for God, you've heard it wrong.
Okay.
Now, you may have heard the song or the book or the sermon right, because that's what they're saying, but
I think that's what I'm wanting to get at, is helping equip not just myself, but everybody in here with the ability to quickly and carefully distinguish when we're hearing a just do it message or an it is done and it is finished message, because it's everywhere. Like if you've been in church for any amount of time, you've all heard that the Christian life is about you doing more and you doing this, this, and this. And it's baked into Christian music. It's baked into most Christian literature. It's baked into every Sunday morning service at least across America. So that's what I'm trying to get at, is I want to, in asking the question, equip each of us with kind of a tool in our tool belt whereby we can say, oh no, I know now how I'm hearing or why I'm hearing things wrong or why this is different, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and that isn't going to happen with a quick answer from me. I think it honestly, it comes with time and being saturated in truth, which Jesus said sets us free. I mean, he talks about himself as the great unburdener of our burdens, the one who sets us free. He gives us his mission statement in Luke 4 and says, I've come to set the captives free. Paul says in Galatians, it is for freedom that Jesus has set you free. So things like freedom and relief and the ability to rest and exhale, that's the essence of the Christian faith. It's an announcement about something that's been done for us. It is, as you mentioned, it is finished faith, not a just do it faith. And so I think one of the ways that you will know, or that you can know, is, and this is going to sound terribly subjective, but how does it make you feel? Honestly. I mean, I'm not saying you base everything on your feelings. Obviously, I think we are fairly rigorous around here about thinking things through and thinking things out. But at the same time, I was talking to a woman this week who I've known for years, and she was really sweet. She actually wrote me to apologize because she felt she had been unfairly critical of some things that I had said, I don't know, 6 or 8 months ago. And she said, out of the blue, she just texted and said, I need to ask for your forgiveness. I'm sorry. And then she explained why. And I told her, of course, and thank you, and I love you, and I always have. And but then she went on to explain how she arrived at that place of sort of skepticism and cynicism, and she said that her and her husband had been going to a church where the predominant message was do more, try harder, muscular Christianity, which according to that pastor was defined as sacrificing more, obeying more, and in doing so, kind of equipping his congregation to discern who was really a Christian and who wasn't. And if this person isn't acting this way or doing this thing, they're clearly not a Christian. So if you want to know if somebody around you is a Christian, then look at the way they live. And so she said, I was hearing that, and I started to believe that. She said, but I also noticed as time went on that the culture in the congregation was just, it was hard. It was critical. It was self-righteous. It was pharisaical. They were right and everybody else was wrong. And it was so important to be right. Doctrinal purity and doctrinal rightness was sort of the be-all and end-all. And she said that the way it was making me feel I mean, in the beginning, I was like, yeah, they're right. This world's falling apart all around us. And so when someone comes with a hard-hitting, do more, try harder, get better, climb higher message, that may be attractive to us initially because we see everybody just sort of flippantly talking about God. God's been removed from the public square. And, the sort of the moral collapse of our world. And so people want to latch on to something that's gritty and it's got teeth to it. And oftentimes that comes in the form of do more, try harder, get better, climb higher. But what happens when that becomes the regular diet of any group, a small group, a church, they're a sort of a thick self-righteousness begins to develop. Right. And we begin to think that we are right and they are wrong. We are what is right with the world. They are what is wrong with the world. So when I say one way to discern whether or not what you're hearing is true or not is how does it make you feel? Yeah. Do you feel unburdened? Yeah. Do you feel more free?
Right.
Do you feel, do you want to be gracious? Are you grateful for the grace and mercy you've been given? Are you getting softer, not harder? Yeah. Are you getting softer? Are you beginning to become more loving, more forgiving, more more gracious, more merciful? Do you have more patience? Yeah. I mean, those things begin to develop when you are marinating in the good news of God's finished work for you and his amazing grace and his outrageous mercy. When that becomes the regular diet, it becomes you and the place that you're a part of becomes soft in all the right ways.
Right. That's good. I appreciate that answer. Anecdotally here, as I was preparing for this conversation, I did some research and began to study sermon notes from other really popular Christian teachers. Popular meaning, if I mentioned their name, you would probably know who they were. And as I read their interpretation and their study notes and their sermon notes from the Beatitudes and the Sermon on the Mount, what I felt myself, or how I felt myself responding as I was reading their interpretation, and their interpretation, to clue you in, was exactly what we just talked about. Do more, try harder. The Beatitudes are here to remind you of what you need to be doing if you want to live like a Christian, if you want to look like someone whose life has been changed by Jesus. These are the things that you need to be doing. In other words, this is the standard. Hold your report card up next to it and make sure you're checking all the right boxes. That's basically what these sermon notes were articulating. And as I was digesting all of this stuff, my own internal, speaking of your, how do you respond? How does it make you feel? My own internal response as I was plowing through all this stuff was like, I can't do that. One of the notes may have been something like, whenever all your friends want to go watch this movie and you need to be the one to stand up and say, no, we're not going to do that. Or you need to be the one to set the standard.
Yeah,
basically.
I'm usually the friend going, let's go to this movie.
It's true.
Yeah,
he's right. Yeah. Basically, the call in these sermon notes was you need to set the standard for right living and godliness or whatever. And as I'm processing through all these sermon notes that I was studying in preparation for this, I'm thinking Jesus did all this for me. He's the one that set the standard, and I have no chance in hell of meeting that. So I better just be in him and enjoy life with him.
And the pushback that I've gotten over the years to a statement like that, which is absolutely true, is, well, that's just going to make us lazy. That's going to make us more disobedient. Right. And I always respond to that by saying, I have never, in all of my years of doing this and all the conversations I've had with people literally all over the world, I have never met anyone whose heart is so gripped and so grasped by God's amazing grace for them that they want to go out and sin more. Yeah, right. If anything, they want to love God better. Yeah, so it is, and 1 John says this, we love him because he first loved us. Right. It's love, not law, that produces love from us to God and to other people. I was preaching on the 10 Commandments when I was a pastor in Fort Lauderdale. I was preaching a series on the 10 Commandments that I called How to Be Perfect. Mm-hmm. And I began that series by saying, if you're into checklists and you want to know how to be perfect, this sermon series is for you, because in 10 simple, easy steps, God gives us an instruction manual on how to be perfect.
Yeah.
And after about 4 weeks of preaching that, and taking the same approach that I took with the Sermon on the Mount, like these commandments are primarily there to show us what God requires, and then to expose us as being unable to fulfill these requirements the way God. I mean, we can do okay, but He requires perfect keeping of the 10 Commandments for it to be a passing grade. So after saying that for a number of weeks, I started getting questions from people, not from inside our church, but from people, around the country who were paying attention to the series. And they said, we understand that before you become a Christian, keeping these are impossible.
Yeah.
Okay, we get that.
Right.
But isn't it true that once you become a Christian and God gives you the Holy Spirit, that you become increasingly capable of keeping the 10 Commandments? Right. And my response to that was, that's an interesting question. It's very theoretical. Yeah. It's a question that would, I think, stimulate a good theological discussion. Yeah. But I'm not primarily interested in whether you can or not. And this was my response, and I said this on Sunday morning when I was down there. But I said, it's not primarily my interest as to whether or not you can. My question is, are you doing it? That's the question. Like, we get so caught up in, well, but can't I? Well, maybe you can. Yeah. I don't know. Yeah. But you're not. Yeah. And that's the issue. Yeah, right. And the issue is, because we're not, Jesus had to do it for us. Yeah, and so sometimes we can get caught up in these sort of theoretical conversations or theoretical debates about whether or not we can keep the 10 Commandments, or whether or not we can follow the Sermon on the Mount as it is given. That's really not the question I'm primarily interested in. And I don't think that was the question that Jesus was primarily interested in. The question Jesus was primarily interested in is, are you doing? This is what you ought to be doing. This is what you should be doing. This is what God the Father requires you to be doing. Are you doing it?
Right, yeah.
And if the answer is no, then just shut up and thank God for Jesus. Yeah. That's it. Yeah, that's it. Yeah. Full stop. Yeah. Rather than trying to sort of come up with some, sort of using theological gymnastics to come up with some reason why you are able to do it. Yeah. The question is, are you doing it? Yeah. And if you're not, which you're not, at least to the degree that God requires you to be doing it, then Jesus is necessary, and all of the necessary work that God the Father requires, Jesus has done.
Yeah, that's so good. I want to read my next question just because I don't think I can off the cuff say it. If this sermon really is meant to be, the sermon meaning not your sermon, but the Sermon on the Mount, if this sermon really is meant to be a merciful wall and not a behavioral ladder to climb, like you said, something that which exposes our inability to keep the law, then why isn't Jesus recorded here in Matthew as saying, you can't do any of this stuff. I'm simply preaching about it as a means of showing you your inability to do it. I'm perfect, and I'll be perfect on your behalf. Basically, why isn't he more direct? Like, if we can all mutually agree, okay, yeah, this makes sense. This is the purpose of the Sermon on the Mount. It exposes our inability to do it. Then why does Jesus not just come out and plainly say that, like as a bookend to the sermon? Does the question make sense?
Yeah.
But why didn't he do that?
Well, you ask Jesus. I don't know. You're asking the wrong person, dude. I have no idea. But it's interesting that
doesn't that seem like... No, but... Why would we have to, if this is so monumental, it feels a little lame to me. Like, come on, Jesus, could you have not just said it like a little more plainly so I don't have to interpret
his everything? Disciples felt the same way every time he would teach in parables.
Yeah.
They would be like, why aren't you just being more clear? Like, why do you have to tell these stories that are so difficult to understand?
What answer did he give?
You're so cryptic, Jesus.
Yeah.
And I don't remember exactly what he said. I don't think he answered their question in the way that they asked it.
We always asked another question.
Yeah. But I think that I could not only say that about the Sermon on the Mount, which I would argue, by the way, that in a sense he does say those things. He just doesn't say them the way you just articulated.
Sure.
When he says, so be perfect as your Father in heaven is
Right.
perfect, that's a pretty direct way of saying, guys, come on.
Yeah, right.
I mean, are you doing this? Are you perfect?
So you're saying Jesus was sarcastic?
Oh, absolutely he was sarcastic. I know for a fact he was sarcastic. He's sarcastic with me on a regular basis. So, no, I think that you could also say that about a lot of other places in the Bible. Like, why isn't it just, I mean, if it's true that God speaks his truth in 2 words, law and gospel, then why is the Bible this thick?
Yeah,
he could have said everything we needed to know in a page or a paragraph. Why in the world?
I mean, that was my next question.
Right, yeah. So, I mean, I think that while I don't have a real answer to why Jesus didn't say it the way you just articulated it, I can say that I think if you hear the Bible explained rightly, Martin Luther said, anyone who is capable of properly distinguishing the law and the gospel is a good theologian indeed. And what he meant was that is the key to understanding everything in the Bible from Genesis to Revelation is understanding that God, in all of the words he speaks, really speaks primarily 2 words, a word of demand and a word of deliverance, a word of diagnosis and a word of deliverance, a word that exposes us and a word that exonerates us. Yeah. And so when you understand that, then a lot of these passages that we read fall into the proper category.
Right.
So, so anything that, like I said before, anything that you read that comes across as a must, as an ought, as a do, it falls under the category of law, which is not bad. Like I said, I think sometimes people can misunderstand what I'm saying and think that I'm distinguishing law and gospel and one is bad and one is good. That's not true. Both are good. Both come from God. Both are necessary, but both have unique job descriptions. Yeah. Both do 2 very different things, and God intends both of those words to do 2 completely different things. Yeah. One is to remind us that we're not good, and one is to remind us that he is. Yeah. One is to remind us that we can't do it, and the other is to remind us that he's done it for us. Yeah. One is to remind us that we are worse than we think we are, and one is to remind us that God's grace is bigger than we could ever hope for or imagine. Yeah, that's good. And so I think when that's the paradigm, the grid, the filter by which you read the entire Bible, then you start hearing some things that Jesus or the other writers say, and they do sound a little bit more clear. Yeah. Like you were saying, like, why didn't Jesus just say this? Yeah. When you understand, okay, law and gospel, then you go, yeah, he's pretty explicit there.
Well, and truly, like I mentioned, and I think I would recommend this for any of you guys that are curious to do it. Just Google search Sermon on the Mount notes, and then enter maybe your favorite pastor that you think, oh yeah, they're saying the right thing.
That's going to take them right to the merciful wall.
There it is. I would say, I can affirm the point that you just made, Tullian, that as I read through these sermon notes, it was so clear to me that the distinction between the it is finished message and the just do it or try harder message, that distinction was so clear as I read these sermon notes. In fact, one of the culminating points that one of these teachers or pastors wrote was basically, as your life with Christ progresses, you can refer back to the Sermon on the Mount and the Beatitudes and know that if you're really saved and if you've really been walking with Jesus, then your life will increasingly look more and more like this. Basically, you will sin less over the trajectory of your life if you're doing this right. Yeah. And I thought, like, what? That's just like an imprisoning idea that, okay, well, I really need to make sure that as I get into my 40s and 50s and 60s, I need to be a better and better dude, And I've heard, I don't know if we've talked about this before, but my favorite quote basically their idea was, this is how you know if you're being sanctified. Anybody ever heard the word sanctification before? You refer to the Sermon on the Mount and you say, okay, I'm got 5 out of 50, now I've got 10 out of 50, I'm doing better over the course of my life. Sanctification, as we've said before, is just the art of you getting used to the fact that Jesus did everything for you, and that you get to rest in.
And that's the struggle.
So, yeah, it's the struggle, right?
The struggle isn't, lust or greed or as much of a struggle as those things, maybe pride. The struggle is believing that it is finished.
Yeah, that's
the struggle.
Right. 100%.
I mean, that is the ongoing struggle. And so, I think, if I were to nuance this a little bit, I might say, you've heard me say, just for the purpose of using shorthand, and to help people understand the difference, the distinction between just do it and it is finished. Yeah. But in a sense, you could say that, it's both and, not either or, but that the just do it portion, which is oftentimes put in the category of gospel, is actually under the category of law.
Correct. Right.
It is finished is put under the category of gospel. So you could say, yes, just do it. Just do it. No, you got to keep doing it. You got to do it better. You got to climb higher. No, you got to jump further.
Right.
And you finally get to a point where you're like, man, I'm worn out, and I haven't really gotten that much further along. Yeah. And then Jesus comes in and says, I know.
Yeah.
And my whole point in telling you to just do it perfectly was to show that you can't. Yeah. Now rest in me. And I pointed out, I think it was last week in John chapter 6, where Jesus' disciples come to him and they say, what must we be doing to be doing the works of God or to be doing the will of God? Yeah. And Jesus says, do you want to know? And they're all excited. They can't wait to hear what he has to say because they want to make sure they're doing it right. Yeah. And Jesus said, simply believe in the one whom he sent. Yeah. Which tells me that the real struggle of the Christian life is not a struggle regarding behavior. It's a struggle regarding belief.
Right. That's good.
That we are all, as John Calvin said, partly unbelievers until we die. We will struggle with unbelief. We believe and we unbelieve.
Yeah.
And so that's the real struggle.
I wrote that down. I'm glad you brought this up because I did bring up, that was in part 10 where you covered John 6. Mm-hmm. So, and this is where my mind goes, man. But how do I know I'm believing? How do I know I'm believing enough or believing rightly? I'm type A, so I want to do it right.
I think when you can say, I believe and I don't believe.
Yeah.
You know you're believing something right. I mean, look, I don't really like questions like that because
got him.
Because it and I know you're asking for a specific reason, but it sort of puts the onus back on me. So
that's good.
So it's almost like, okay, you've told me I can't do enough. I get that. That has finally settled, and I've embraced that.
And now I just have to believe.
Now I have to believe enough.
Right.
And I'm like, dude, at the end of the day, it's not about you.
That's good.
It's not about you and whether you're believing enough or doing enough or progressing far enough or improving enough, however we define that. And let me just say this. And I think I've said this here on Sunday mornings before, but I grew up believing that spiritual growth was I start off a bad guy, and over the course of my life, I get better and better and better. And at the end of my life, I end up a good guy.
Yeah, right.
That I needed Jesus a lot to get me in the door, but now it's my responsibility to clean up the house.
Yeah.
And what we see in the Bible is something very different. In fact, we see the exact opposite. For instance, Paul, the Apostle Paul in Philippians chapter 3, he gives us his spiritual resume. He says, when I started, I was at the top of my game, man. I mean, I was a religious dynamo. I was a Pharisee of Pharisees. I knew the law backwards and forwards. I graduated at the top of my class. Yeah. I was fervent to do things for God and to make sure that his people were pure. I was a law keeper. I was a law enforcer. Yeah. And then he said, as time went on, God systematically deconstructed me and showed me that my righteousness, my goodness was nothing more than filthy rags. Yeah. So now I'm at the end of my life, he says, and I'm able to acknowledge that I'm the chief of sinners.
Yep.
I'm the worst guy that I know. So rather than Christian growth being starting from the bottom and moving up, Christian growth is actually starting off thinking that we don't really need God and we can do it. Yeah. And then over time, God's systematically breaking us down so that by the time we get to the end of our lives, we're just going, without the mercy of God, I'm screwed.
Yeah. Good.
And I think that's Christian growth. Christian growth is not starting at the bottom and ending up at the top. It's starting at the top and ending up at the bottom.
And knowing he's there with you at the bottom.
Yes, and just to go, when Paul says at the end of his life, I'm the least of all the saints. I'm the worst guy that I know. My friend Jean Leroux, who I've quoted before, says, if you're not the worst sinner you know, you don't know yourself very well. And it's true. I know that to be because I know myself better than I know anybody else. And so I understand my sin and know my sin more than I know anybody else's sin or understand anybody else's sin. So, and the flip side of that is the kind of person that produces is someone who's soft to be around.
Yeah, right.
Someone who understands that they're no better than anybody else. Yep. That if it weren't for the grace and mercy of God, they would be screwed, lost, hopeless. That person is the kind of person I always enjoy being around because you can say anything to those people. You can confess any amount of sin or secrets to those people, and they're not going to blink. Because they're going to know that your circumstances may be different than my circumstances, but I'm no better than you are. My sin may look different than yours. I may sin differently than you, but I'm no better than you are. And so I just think that I think that's one of the beautiful things that the law does is it humbles us.
Sure.
It really humbles us, and it helps us to see that we're no better than anybody else. Yeah. That, the ground is level at the foot of the cross. Yeah. That there is no spiritual or moral hierarchy in God's economy. And the law is what teaches us that. The law is what shows us that. And then, of course, the softness of the gospel coming in with, the shepherd's arms wrapped around us and reminding us it's going to be okay. I got you. Yeah, no matter what, I got you, dude. You're going to screw up 1,000 more times before you die, and I got you. My love for you is not dependent on your screw-ups or not screw-ups. It's dependent on my love for you. Yeah. I love you because I love you, full stop. Right. And so I just think that creates a kind of person. When you look at the fruit of the Spirit that Paul talks about, love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, gentleness, self-control, all of those fruits, let me remind you first, those are fruits of the Spirit. They're not fruits of Tullian. When those things show up in my life to whatever degree, I can't take credit for it. Like, wow, I've really worked hard and look at what I've become. Yeah. These are fruits of the Spirit. This is God's work in me. But all of those things, love, joy, peace, patience, those are all fruits that are developed in the context of grace, in the context of mercy, in the context of love and forgiveness. The more we come to terms with how loved and how forgiven we are and how much grace and how much mercy we've been given, those things develop. If I think I'm pretty good and you're not trekking with me, you're further behind morally than I am, and I'm proud of where I am, and I'm frustrated by where you are, I'm not going to be patient with you. I'm going to be like, dude, are you not serious about God? Come on. Look at everything he's done for you. You can't do more? I can't believe you're spending your money like that. Shouldn't you be giving more to the church? Which, by the way, I'm just kidding. But literally, I'm going to be judgmental. Yeah. I'm going to be impatient. I'm going to be the antithesis of everything described in the fruit of the Spirit. The antithesis of that.
Right. Yeah, that's good. Well, I think we're nearing the end of our time this morning. Is anybody watching the clock? One of you out there is watching the clock.
Yeah. It's we should probably wrap it up in a minute or two. We're taking communion this morning, so this is like a full
it's
full
gonna be a great morning. Well, I would just say the conversation this morning has been incredibly helpful to me, and I just another reminder. I would reiterate to you, like what Tullian said, be attentive to that feeling. Like what is your guttural response to the various messages that you hear? Because you're bombarded with messages. If you're immersed in any kind of Christian subculture, you're hearing a lot of messages that are not, "It is finished." And my favorite, I think, part of the whole sermon series was really the final sermon. My wife and I got to talk about it briefly before I came out here, about just enjoy the gift. And, the peace that comes from that is magnificent. So
I'm looking for something real quick.
you checking the Heat game time?
Let's go Heat. Heat Knicks. Let's go. Hold on. I'm trying to look for something that I
This is what I deal with here, folks.
sent.
He's just on his phone.
Stacy, honey, are my glasses over there anywhere? Can you please toss them to me? Thank you. Okay. This is something that I sent that woman who messaged me. It's a quick little piece from my friend Ray Ortland.
Okay.
Who said, he makes 3 points. What is gospel doctrine? And this is his answer. Gospel doctrine is the biblical message of divine grace for the undeserving. God, through the perfect life, atoning death, and bodily resurrection of Jesus, rescues all of us from the wrath of God and moves us into peace with God, with a promise of the full restoration of his created order forever, all to the praise of the glory of his grace. Next question he asks, what is gospel culture? Gospel culture is the shared experience of grace for the undeserving, the corporate incarnation of the biblical message in the relationships, vibe, feel, tone, values, priorities, aroma, honesty, freedom, gentleness, humility, cheerfulness. That's what he's saying. That's gospel culture. When you kind of know whether a church believes the gospel, preaches the gospel, and embodies the reality of the gospel when it's soft, warm. And then he asks a third question. Why does this matter? He says, why must our churches preach gospel doctrine and embody gospel culture simultaneously by God's grace? And then he goes on to say, because the requirement to be doctrinally pure in our churches doesn't cut it. It also needs to be relationally beautiful. But it is possible sincerely to preach doctrine while at the same time utterly deny that doctrine by an ugly anti-gospel culture. And one of the things that we talk about around here is that there is a huge difference between grace on paper and grace in practice. In order for there to be grace in practice, there must be some semblance of grace on paper. But grace on paper doesn't automatically create grace in practice. And so one of the ways that you can know whether what you're hearing is true or what you're experiencing is true is just ask yourself, if I really blew it, I mean, publicly tanked my life, made an incredibly destructive decision and hurt myself and a lot of other people, is the church I'm going to a place that I would run to for help? Wow. Or would I go, or would I avoid that place because I would feel like a failure and judged? Yeah. That's a huge question. Right. Huge, because I hear from people literally all over the world who have made some really bad, destructive decisions, and they've hurt themselves and a lot of other people. And they don't feel like they can even talk to their pastor, much less go to their church. They talk about the fact that a lot of their Christian friends have sort of pulled away from them. They feel like they've been somewhat ostracized. They're being punished by silence and distance and all those kinds of things. And that may be a church that talks about grace. Right, but there's a huge difference between grace on paper and grace in practice. And one of the things, when Stacy and I moved here 4 years ago to start the sanctuary, we talked very openly about the place that we wanted it to be a safe place to fall and a soft place to land. A place where you can really, because we've screwed up, so we know the kind of company we need, the kind of community we need, and we recognize that there are a lot of people out there like us who need to be reminded that God loves them unconditionally. And so I think one of the ways, like I said, to discern, am I hearing this right or am I not hearing it right? Is if you really just ask yourself, wherever you are, online too, if you ask yourself about your church, it's an important question to ask. If I really screwed up bad, and it was on the front page of the paper the next day, would I avoid the people in my church, or would I feel like they were the safest place to run to?
Yeah, that's huge. I love it. So good. Well, love you, man.
Thanks, man. Thank
really
you.
Great.
Always good when you're here.
Yeah.
Thanks for flying in.
Yeah. Awesome.